For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. The ancient city of Heliopolis in Lebanon, better known as Baalbek, sports some of the most impressive architecture of the ancient world. The sheer size of some of the building stones found here have spawned alternative history theories about their origins. If you're interested in the site of Baalbek and whether present-day historians and archaeologists have their story straight about who built these magnificent structures, stick around, because we're going to get into the details. Brien Foerster is a big name in the alternative history business. He has written numerous books on lost ancient high technology and has been featured several times on Ancient Aliens. He claims to be an expert on the megalithic works of South America, and his website, hiddenincatours.com, arranges tours there and to various other parts of the world, during which he offers his personal views on the sites, views that are frequently at odds with mainstream scholarship. The ruins of Baalbek have piqued Mr. Foerster's interest, and he has taken tours there as well. Although all the archaeologists who have worked at the site have concluded that the temples and other large structures at Baalbek are of Greco-Roman origin, Mr. Foerster is of the opinion that there are remains there of a lost advanced civilization from the Stone Age. On his YouTube channel, he has posted a lecture that he gave, I'm not sure where, titled Baalbek in Lebanon, Megaliths of the Gods. It has over 300,000 views. In some of this lecture, he deals with the topic of the trilithon stones and the unfinished stones in the quarry near the site. Since I've already discussed that at length in a previous video, I'm going to focus here on claims he makes about the large granite columns found at Baalbek. If you're interested in the trilithon and the quarry, please check out my other video, which is called Baalbek Mystery of the Trilithon Stones. I also have an interview posted of one of the archaeologists who worked at the site, which you may find of interest. But now let's see what he says about the granite columns and see if there is substance to his conclusions.
The pillar in the foreground is made of granite, whereas most of the construction of Baalbek is limestone from the quarry. We see that granite is also located here. So the question is, where did the granite come from? And luckily we brought a geologist with us from Canada, and she had just been with us in Egypt, so she was able to figure out that the granite of Baalbek was probably from the Aswan quarry located in southern Egypt.
The geologist is probably correct that the stone came from Aswan in Egypt. But Aswan wasn't the only active quarry in the area where you could get granite. The Greeks weren't comfortable using granite, but the Romans used it quite a bit. They not only reopened the Egyptian granite quarries that had fallen out of use, but also opened up some of their own, new ones, such as Mons Claudianus and Wadi Fawakir in Egypt, as well as several in Asia Minor, Italy, and Germany. A scientific study done recently analyzed 1,176 granite columns from the Roman era in 7 regions around the Mediterranean, and traced them to their original quarries. Yeah, 1,176 of them, and that's just a sample. They were taken from 126 different sites. Unfortunately for us, Lebanon was not one of them. Most of the granite production occurred between the 1st century BCE and the 4th century CE, with the peak during the 2nd century CE. Anyway, these granite columns were traced by geochemical analysis to 16 different quarries. But that list is incomplete. There's a handy website, the Oxford Roman Economy Project, and one of their databases is of stone quarries. You can filter by the type of stone, and there are 46 granite quarries that come up. 46, which were used in Roman times. Check it out if you get a chance. But the type of granite obtained from Aswan, with its bright pink feldspar crystals, is fairly easy to identify, and I have no reason to doubt that the granite at Baalbek came from Aswan.
And the Aswan quarry is 1,000 miles away. So that's curious, and that's also something that we see in other ancient locations. The stone isn't necessarily from the present locality, but can have been brought from hundreds of miles away.
I don't know why Mr. Foerster, whom I assume knows something about Roman granite, finds this curious. The overseas stone trade was a big and bustling industry. After marble, granite was the next most widely used stone for structural or decorative purposes in Roman times. It was worked in enormous quantities for the manufacture of columns, flooring and facing slabs, and large tubs. To show off their supremacy, the emperors made major spectacles of Roman engineering and organization by erecting magnificent structures. Even the convoy of stones and other building material commanded significant attention and was a source of pride to the emperors. As Roman elites moved into new territories acquired from the expansion of the Roman Empire, stone for building came in high demand, and even the local elites wanted to copy the Roman building style, which was very much in fashion. The Roman style was, of course, itself a copy of the Greek style. So yeah, granite was transported over long distances in the Roman period quite commonly.
So questions automatically arise. How was the stone moved from that exotic location? And why was it important to bring the granite all the way from Aswan?
This stone was not brought in from an outside territory, which wouldn't have been unusual either, but it merely was transported within the empire's own borders. Egypt was part of the Roman Empire, and Baalbek was part of the Roman Empire. And Aswan granite was brought much further than Baalbek. There is Aswan granite in the city of Rome itself. Aswan granite is found all over the empire.
So as we explore the complex at Baalbek, again, we see very massive stonework. This again is likely from the Megalithic period, which is pre-Roman. And then here, again, the foundation appears to be megalithic with smaller stones on top. And then on the upper right-hand side, you see granite columns that have been reconstructed.
The term that he used, megalithic period, is not a real archaeological period. It's made up. I don't know who coined it. I think the term is a holdover from literature of the 1800s, but just so you know, various academic disciplines have divided the history of the world into time periods. So there are geological time periods, archaeological time periods, historical time periods, art history time periods, etc. And in none of them will you find something called the megalithic period. The idea of a megalithic period that Mr. Foerster appears to be proposing is that there was a time during which large stones were used in construction. At least that's what the name suggests. The thing is, large stones were used in construction in many time periods in many parts of the world. They aren't restricted to one time.
Being in the presence of something of this complexity and antiquity raises lots of questions, both in terms of ancient engineering and very much makes us ask whether academics have the full story. And from what you'll see, they have not fully described the antiquity and complexity at Baalbek. So here, for example, as you saw in previous photographs, you saw sections of granite columns. But what this shows us is the bottom part, which is still intact. And the surfaces here are perfectly smooth, perfectly polished, and this column is perfectly round. So that tells us originally it was between 15 and 20 feet tall and was made of one piece of stone. The only way that could have been achieved would be on a giant lathe.
I was hoping he might have provided the scientific evidence that these columns were made on giant lathes, but he never really gets into it. Fortunately, the Romans left us with information how columns were made, both in their writings and from what we see in the material evidence, like partially completed objects. First, quarrymen with iron picks outlined the general shape of the object they wanted to excavate. Then they drove in wooden wedges with mallets to force the stone loose. Alternately, they used the pointier method, making a straight line of small pits in the stone, and then hammering back and forth between them using iron chisels. After getting the stone loose, stonemasons would roughly shape it with iron chisels. By the way, the iron the Romans used was basically a low-grade steel. It was important that enough stone was taken off the column so that it could be transported more easily, but not so much that it could be damaged when moving. Once the object got to the site, smoothing was done using flat chisels or rasps, and then polishing would be done by abrasive stones or powders. There were different gradations of polish. The finer the abrasive, the finer the polish. Only certain stones were able to be polished, but granite is one of them.
And the technology to be able to shape granite to this fineness and high polish was only developed once we had diamond tool technology. And that didn't occur until the late 19th century AD. So not only was it impossible for the Romans to have constructed this, but literally these 300 ancient columns had to have been found by the Romans and then reused.
So here he states his main thesis, that the Romans could not have made these columns, or more specifically, that these columns could not have been made by anyone in Roman times, and therefore the columns must come from a different time period. The strange thing is, although he says that the technology to make such columns was not developed until the 19th century, his conclusion is not that the columns come from the 19th century or later, but from a time earlier than the Romans, a time for which there is no evidence of the technology he assumes, except for the columns themselves. If the Romans discovered hundreds of granite columns somewhere in mint condition, surely someone would have mentioned it. That would be an amazing find, right? The Romans were known for taking spoils in every region they conquered and bragging about the acquisition. Why not say that here? And there are more than 300 granite columns that were used by the Romans. There were thousands. Why did no writer from any of the centuries of the Roman period mention all the ready-made columns that supposedly were already there? And perhaps more importantly, why were the granite columns made according to the same construction model as Greek and Roman marble columns? The only explanation that makes sense is that the marble and granite columns were made by the same people.
So this again shows you quite clear evidence that the columns themselves, all 300 of them in granite, were turned on ancient lathes. We don't actually have this technology today, or if we do, it's very recent. But if you go back 200 years, these could not have been made, and you go back 2,000 years, and there is no way they could have been made by the Romans. And once again, the detail. You see the smooth surfaces, and this indicates lost ancient high technology at Baalbek in Lebanon.
Note how he just says it as a matter of fact. Doesn't he know that beautiful, large-scale granite work has been created from ancient times to the present? The existence of such work demonstrates that we don't have to make up a new civilization to account for it.
And once again, all of this granite, 300 columns being at least 15 feet, if not 20 feet tall, each was originally one piece of stone. All of them came from Aswan, which is 1,000 miles away. So how many ships would that have taken? And how would they have been transported from the quarry in southern Egypt all the way up the Nile to the Mediterranean and then to the site of Baalbek?
Okay, so he keeps bringing this up, so it looks like we'll need to take a closer look. Would it have been impossible, or at least financially impractical, for the Romans to have moved the materials from Aswan to Baalbek? Marble, actually, is heavier than granite and therefore would have been more challenging to move. In other words, if they could transport marble, they could transport granite. And they transported marble galore. And I don't hear Mr. Foerster arguing otherwise. Several emperors, including Augustus and Caligula, had giant granite obelisks transported from Egypt all the way to Rome, a notable event in those days. But as time passed, more and more obelisks from Egypt were brought to Rome. First-century historian Pliny the Elder describes the transport this way. But the most difficult enterprise of all was the carriage of these obelisks by sea to Rome, in vessels that excited the greatest admiration. Indeed, the late Emperor Augustus consecrated the one that brought over the first obelisk as a lasting memorial of this marvelous undertaking in the docks of Puteoli, but it was destroyed by fire. As to the one in which, by order of the Emperor Caligula, the other obelisk had been transported to Rome, after having been preserved for some years and looked upon as the most wonderful construction ever beheld upon the seas, it was brought to Ostia by order of the late Emperor Claudius. And towers of Puteolan earth being first erected upon it, It was sunk for the construction of the harbor he was making there. The Pantheon in Rome, built during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, sports these magnificent granite columns, 40 Roman feet high, 5 Roman feet in diameter. They came all the way from Egypt. The 8 light gray ones in the front from Mons Claudianus, and the pink ones in the middle and back rows from Aswan. One of these columns is estimated to weigh about 50 to 55 metric tons. A granite column such as found at Baalbek, being shorter and less wide than one from the Pantheon, would have weighed less. The Emperor Maxentius had marble columns weighing more than 100 tons each, along with thousands of tons of additional marble transported from the island of Proconnesus, 1,500 miles to the Roman Forum. Water transport, by the way, is much easier than land transport, so the bulk of the journey would have been a relative cinch. The largest cargo ships in Roman times could carry loads up to 250 tons. But sometimes special ships were constructed. A granite obelisk weighing 510 tons was transported from Thebes in Egypt down the Nile to the Mediterranean by Constantine the Great. A gigantic ship had to be built to carry it. Ancient Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus recounts what happened with this massive monolith. Whereas Octavianus Augustus had brought over 2 obelisks from the city of Heliopolis in Egypt, one of which was set up in the Circus Maximus, the other in the Campus Martius. As for this one recently brought in, he neither ventured to meddle with it nor move it, overawed by the difficulties caused by its size. Let me inform those who do not know it that early emperor, after bringing over several obelisks, passed by this one and left it untouched because it was consecrated as a special gift to the sun god, and because being placed in the sacred part of his sumptuous temple, which might not be profaned, there it towered aloft like the peak of the world. But Constantine, that is, Constantine the Great, making little account of that, tore the huge mass from its foundations. And since he rightly thought that he was committing no sacrilege if he took this marvel from one temple and consecrated it at Rome, that is to say, in the temple of the whole world, he let it lie for a long time, while the things necessary for its transfer were being provided. And when it had been conveyed down the channel of the Nile and landed at Alexandria, a ship of a size hitherto unknown was constructed to be rowed by 300 oarsmen. Constantine died before he got it to Rome, and his son Constantius II completed the task. We have written documentation from Egypt that animals, camels usually, were used in the transportation of stone from the quarries to the Nile River. One papyrus speaking of a 50-foot column being transported in this way. A 50-foot column would have weighed about 150 tons. It's been calculated that a column weighing 207 tons would have exerted a pressure of 6.9 kilograms per square centimeter on the wheels of a 12-wheeled wagon. That's not an excessive load. One camel is capable of hauling 1 ton, so a 150-ton column would need 150 camels to move it. Is that unrealistic? Well, we have a record that speaks of 64 mules being used to haul a sarcophagus. The Roman poet Tibullus, musing about the life of a merchant, wrote, "His fancy turns to foreign marbles, and through the trembling city his column is carried by 1,000 sturdy pairs of oxen." This may be hyperbole, but clearly large teams of animals were used to move heavy items. There's no doubt that moving columns would have been expensive. Still, it would have been more expensive to move a bunch of column sections than one whole column because of the extra time involved or extra wagons and extra drivers needed. The raising of columns employed a variety of equipment, including cranes and lift towers. Vitruvius, a Roman engineer and architect, in the 10th book of his work On Architecture, describes how Greeks invented machines that could move and lift heavy blocks and columns in the construction of temples. If you want to read it, I'll leave a link below the video. Ammianus Marcellinus describes the erection of the 510-ton granite obelisk in the middle of the city of Rome during the reign of Constantius II. Now there remained only the raising, which it was thought could be accomplished only with great difficulty, perhaps not at all. But it was done in the following manner. To tall beams, which were brought and raised on end like a grove of derricks, were fastened long and heavy ropes in the likeness of a manifold web to hide the sky with their excessive numbers. To these were attached that veritable mountain, and it was gradually drawn upon high through the empty air, and after hanging for a long time, while many thousand men turned wheels resembling millstones, it was finally placed in the middle of the circus. Today it stands before the Basilica of St. John Lateran.
And again, with a sense of scale, you have a number of people in the upper left-hand area, and they are walking across stones in a row, each of which weighs 800 tons. And then you see the smaller work above that. The smaller work above is the work by the Romans. The foundational stones of 800-ton blocks each is the work of the earlier and more mysterious megalithic builders.
He uses instances where he finds larger stones below smaller stones to make a case that the larger stones are from an earlier time period. The problem is that this is not always the case. There are clear instances where smaller stones are below larger stones. If you watch my earlier video on Baalbek, and if you haven't, please go check it out after watching this one, you will know that there are many remains below the 800-ton stones, beneath the surface, including a Neolithic village.
And this just shows you once again the sense of scale. How would 800-ton blocks have been moved from the quarry at Baalbek, even just 1 mile to this location? The idea that tree trunks were used is highly unlikely because these blocks would have crushed any wooden roller that was put underneath them. Also, the terrain is not flat, so they would have had to have been pushed up and down hills.
This was brought up in the comment section of my previous Baalbek video a couple of times. I'm sorry to say that what he's claiming here is untrue. A tree trunk can indeed bear that amount of weight, or I should say, many tree trunks. Different types of wood are different, but wood generally can bear about 625 pounds per square inch. If you have trees underneath the entire bottom of the stone, with an area that large, it would handle the weight no problem. Wooden rollers would not be crushed because the weight is spread out over a bunch of them. This can be calculated mathematically. And it was all downhill to the temple, not up and down hills. That was discussed in my earlier video and in the interview I did with one of the archaeologists who worked on the site.
And this is Roman. This is classic Roman work in limestone. You see the fine detail. And the intriguing thing is that in the megalithic work, we find no art whatsoever. It's all simply shape and form. This is also what we find at other locations, which are megalithic, such as in Egypt, the interior and exterior of the Great Pyramid. We do not see any artwork whatsoever. And so this indicates that the megalithic builders were simply pragmatic. Art meant nothing to them. All they were interested in is scale, form, and function.
Foerster is using the presence or absence of detail work and art as an indicator of whether stonework comes from his presumed megalithic period or not. This is convenient because art styles help us to date artifacts, but if you remove all the art, it's easier for you to date the artifact to whatever time period you like. And even if a structure has art on it, you can do what he does and say the art is from a different time period from the plain parts. But for this assumption to work, it needs to be consistent, and it isn't. There are clear instances in Roman times where simple shape and form stonework was employed. That means the lack of detail work cannot be used as a reliable indicator of what isn't Roman.
And this gives you another sense of scale. You see the block on the left-hand side next to the staircase. That block weighs at least 800 tons. The staircase is made of much smaller stones, and the stones above the giant megalithic block are from the Roman period, roughly put into place. And this just emphasizes that, the difference between this 800-ton block and here, the smaller Roman work.
See those holes in the side of the 800-ton block? Guess what those were for? Yes, good guess. They were used to move the block. You ever hear of a holivella? It's a device invented by the Greeks and used by the Romans to move stones. A stone cutter would carve small rectangular holes in the stone. A holivella would be placed in each one. Then the pin would be removed and iron slices placed between until the fit was tight. The pin would be replaced, ropes tied to the holivella, and they'd be good to go. What this tells us is that those 800-ton blocks were not only moved without advanced tech, but they were moved by the Romans. You can see holes of the same type on stones that Mr. Foerster says are Roman.
And here we have column sections weighing in at least 50 tons apiece. And there, Stephen Mailer is pointing to a drill hole. That's a perfectly round drill hole. Could that have been done by the Romans in order to connect the different sections of the columns together? Possibly. But what we see are the surfaces are completely and perfectly flat, almost laser flat.
Almost laser flat? How does he know that? He'd have to use a tool that could take a measurement where he could justify making such a statement, right? You can't figure that out with the naked eye, or with an everyday straight edge. But my bet is, they used no precision measuring tool to find out. The fact is, the Romans were perfectly capable of making a flat surface, so flat that it looked perfect to the naked eye.
So, of course, that's me standing next to a section of a giant column. And this is where it gets fuzzy, because in a lot of cases we'll see profound difference between the megalithic work and the later, in this case, Roman work. But in this case, are the giant sections megalithic, or are they amazing works by the Romans? That I still can't figure out.
I am glad to see that he can hold back from making definitive statements, but he's kind of stuck here. Remember, his evidence for attributing the columns to mysterious megalithic builders is showing whole granite columns, which he thinks could only have been made on a lathe. If he says these column sections are from megalithic times, he cannot say they were made on a lathe. On the other hand, if he says these column sections are Roman, he has to admit that the Romans got large and finely worked granite objects from Aswan. So, not wanting to be pinned down on either, he says he can't figure it out.
But this shows you, again, incredibly flat surfaces. We see no errors in the work. Normally the work of human sculptors or stonemasons, you will see errors. You'll see slight indentations or slight protrusions based on the fact that the tool technology they had, which was likely iron or possibly steel, once in a while they would make an error of some kind. But in the case of where I'm looking right now, that surface is as close to perfection as is possible.
But he is just eyeballing it. The Romans had craftsmen that could very easily make sculptures that looked perfect to the naked eye. Yeah, there were artisans with greater and lesser skills in Roman times, as in all times. The presence of unskilled work in a certain period does not show that all work from that time period was unskilled, because there were people with a variety of skills.
And then we get to another fuzzy area. There you see me next to a series of giant columns. The columns are made in sections, approximately 6 to 7 feet tall. So it is possible that the Romans were able to construct this. Again, the important point to emphasize is that the earlier megalithic columns made of granite were one single piece of stone, and the later work of the Romans was multi-sectional.
Okay, so then he is acknowledging that there was a granite industry in Aswan in Roman times, and that the Romans brought heavy granite objects from Egypt here to Baalbek. So the only reason I can think of that Romans couldn't have put these columns here are that the Romans never quarried whole columns, and that whole columns were too heavy for them to transport. And yet, we also have already seen with our own eyes whole granite columns that were quarried by the Romans, such as at Mons Claudianus, a quarry that was used only during Roman times. And we know not only from documents, but also by the presence of Egyptian granite in various parts of the empire, that granite obelisks and whole columns, well in excess of 100 tons, were transported by the Romans. And we know from mathematical calculation that Roman technology could move these objects over long distances. So I have to wonder whether Mr. Foerster has additional evidence that the Romans could not have made the whole columns that he hasn't revealed in this talk. Or is that it?
Another question arises, and that's that the work in Rome itself was never of this scale. So why is it that the Romans were working in such a huge scale, far, far away in the hinterlands of their empire? That, again, has not been satisfactorily answered.
This is not in the hinterlands. Baalbek was in a Roman province. In fact, this area, the eastern side of the empire, was the most urban, the most prosperous, the most inhabited part of the empire. Roman emperors frequently came to this area.
And here, it's kind of hard to see, but in the next photograph, you'll see the megalithic work on the left-hand side at the bottom, and then the archwork on top is of a smaller scale. So it's quite likely in this photograph that the rougher, larger work on the bottom was the megalithic work, and then the Romans added the archwork on top.
Why is it not possible that the people who made this tunnel decided to use heavier stones on the bottom and smaller stones on top? Doesn't that make sense? And I'm curious, why is Mr. Foerster not commenting on the smooth, polished, almost laser-flat, perfect surface of the megalithic work here? Well, obviously he can't. It's rough, as you can see. So my question for him is, what tools did the megalithic builders use to cut these stones? Were they machines with laser-like precision, or something else?
Also, the amount of erosion on the surfaces of the lower stones indicates a greater antiquity than those above. You see the discoloration, you see the weathering, and so this photo, possibly by itself, shows you that two different civilizations were involved.
So apparently we have stones from the megalithic period that are perfect, and we have stones from the same time period that are rough. If they are the same age, why are some rough and some not? Why is this block, right in the same area, not eroded at all? According to his logic, wouldn't the erosion of these stones, which are under a roof, and the lack of erosion on this one, indicate that they're from two different civilizations? What scientific method is he using to determine how much time it would have taken to erode those stones? What caused the erosion? Is this wind erosion? Rain erosion? What? He said he had a geologist with him. What did the geologist say about this? Even if we assumed the rough appearance on these stones is from erosion, does it look to you, imagining what these stones look like when they were not eroded, like they were precisely cut? Not to me. Now, I can't get a full look at them from the photo, but I would be willing to bet that those marks you see on the stones are quarrying marks, not features of erosion. If you would like to research it yourself, there's a great website called Quarryscapes, which includes all kinds of information on ancient quarries, including a guide to identifying the quarry tool by the marks seen on the stone. See if you can figure out what tool made these marks.
And once again, there are many of these stones in the foundation at the Baalbek religious area. I would say there are at least 20 to 30 to possibly even 40 stones locked in place at 800 to possibly 1,000 tons.
And those stones are placed in front of, and they block, a once exterior wall that was built in the Roman period. How is that possible under Mr. Foerster's assumptions? If we were to believe him, the Romans would have had to have constructed an exterior wall on the inside of these large blocks. Not very likely. More likely is that the larger stones were placed here after, not before. More on this in my earlier Baalbek video.
And then contrast that with the work of the Romans in the background. A very great architectural and engineering achievement, but this work is humanly possible, and the other work is possibly not the work of humanity. We don't know who the ancient megalithic builders were. Were they so-called Atlanteans? Were they aliens? Were they an unknown culture that simply disappeared? That is something that we are presently working on.
Okay, this is where he jumps the shark. He argued that the columns were made on a lathe and that they were precisely made, and now asserts that none of that was humanly possible. What's not human about a lathe or moving heavy objects? That's a technological issue, not a species issue. Mr. Foerster deliberately is not taking a position on the question of whether he thinks it's aliens or Atlanteans or an unknown culture. His fan base consists of people from all three camps, and he risks alienating some if he comes down on one side. So it's better for him to say, that is something we're presently working on. I encourage you to ask him what scientific work he and his team specifically are doing in order to determine the answer.
This is Roman work. Again, you see smaller stones, you see artwork, you see arches, you see surface decoration. But what's intriguing are the two columns, because those two columns are the granite. The one on the left-hand side was broken into sections and then rebuilt during the Roman time period, and then the one on the right is still a single piece of stone. So that is one of the only pre-Roman works in granite that is still in place. And again, at least 15 to 20 feet tall, and had to have been turned on a massive lathe.
If Mr. Foerster would have asked someone, he would have found out that the column on the left was reconstructed in modern times because it fell and broke. Notice the base under the right one. That's clearly Roman. So his assertion that it remained in place must be wrong, unless he thinks the Romans moved the column, put the base there, and lifted the column back onto the base. If that were the case, then the Romans clearly had the technology to put the granite column there in the first place.
And again, just to emphasize the fine work of the Romans in limestone, which is relatively soft. And in contrast, the ancient cutting marks in granite. To emphasize hardness, limestone is about 3 to 3.5 in hardness out of 10, with 10 being diamond, and granite is 7 out of 10. So the only technology we know of that can cut granite efficiently is diamond technology.
Is that true? That the only technology that can cut granite is diamond? No, it's not. Mr. Foerster is using the Mohs scale, which jewelers use, and it's based on what stones are able to scratch what other stones. It's a relative scale in which stones are ranked, but the rankings are not equally spaced. There are 5 other hardness scales, and if you look at those that measure hardness absolutely instead of relatively, you will see that using diamond on granite would be overkill. Roman iron, steel, was perfectly capable of cutting granite efficiently. Mr. Foerster is the first person I've ever heard say otherwise. He is simply wrong. The Romans themselves measured the material strength of stone used for building, dividing it into 6 categories: very soft, soft, semi-firm, firm, hard, and cold. Marble and granite were considered cold, and the Romans regularly cut both. They were used by the elite class because they were more expensive. The harder the stone, the more fine detail it could hold. So that's why the hardest stones were preferred by the rich. So basically, the hardness indicated what the stone could be used for. Categorizing the stones by strength, therefore, was equivalent to categorizing them by purpose.
And again, what these ancient cut marks were from, are they modern? Were they done prior to this being made a World Heritage Site? We do see some rust marks, so that indicates possible steel technology.
Yep, technology that the Romans possessed.
But these are mysterious aspects of Baalbek that, as far as I can tell, academics and specifically archaeologists do not want to look at.
But they do look at it. I don't know if he's purposely lying or just doesn't know. Anyway, he goes on to talk about another site, Byblos, which I don't have time to address right now. This video has gotten long enough. But if you're worried that I took anything he said out of context, I will leave a link to his video below so that you can check to make sure. I want to be as fair as possible. If you like ancient history and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do, and feel free to check out more of my videos. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word, so feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.